Hello and welcome to this video interview of this season's winner of the Global Ethics and Trust in Finance for a Sustainable Future Prize. This edition 2020-2021 has been very exciting for me personally as co-president of the jury. The quality of the essays has been phenomenal. And this year's prize winner, Julie, has really touched on a key topic, which is when we look at sustainability, we really need to look at some pricing and measurements, because otherwise how can we do this revolution? And I think I see it in the sort of takeaway from COP26. Everybody's speaking about their long-term commitments, but nobody's looking at the short term. And of course, when you look at measurements in order to affect that revolution, the short term is key. So Julie, you are from Canada, and I'd love to hear from which part of Canada. Also, I love your country, and your paper was called Justice and Sustainability, Pricing in Physical Climate Risks. Again, a topic really close to my heart, because in the EU we are really seeing a revolution, and a very difficult revolution for companies and financial institutions. So any help with that will be really welcome. I'm Josina Kamerling, Head of Regulatory Outreach for CFA Institute and co-president of the Global Prize, together with Paul Dambinski. So I look forward to some of your answers. Now, in our first question, what motivated you personally from your career to discuss the issue of pricing in the physical risk from climate change?
Thank you so much, Josina, for that introduction. To answer your question, I am from Montreal, Canada, traditional Haudenosaunee territory, and to discuss what motivated me to write about this subject, I started thinking about environmental justice and the physical risks from climate change and how finance related to all of that in 2018 or 2019. And two pieces really prompted me to focus on this area and to bring these two areas together. First I saw sustainable finance becoming mainstream, and forgive me because here in North America, we've been a few years behind on the sustainable finance trend. But everyone was starting to focus, I found, really on disclosure here, only on disclosure. So investors focused primarily on the risks, the environmental, social governance risks to their portfolio and communicating that out. Investors were focused on mitigating those risks, not necessarily on achieving positive impact or positive outcomes. And so I saw some paradoxes here when it comes to pricing in the physical risks from climate change, and investors were starting to price those in to disclose that. I saw a huge risk for capital flight from the most vulnerable regions. So, what does it mean if an investor starts to price in the physical risks to their portfolio? An investor may choose to exclude investments with high physical climate risk or demand a higher return as compensation for that risk. But let's say you're a company CEO or a municipality treasurer in a country in the global south. You're facing existential threats from climate change already. You may want to raise capital to invest in mitigating climate change or adapting to local damages, but you need to raise that capital. But what if investors are evaluating climate risk and they're now excluding investments in areas vulnerable to climate change or increasing the cost of capital? How do you afford that adaptation mitigation as someone in a vulnerable region? So you can see that investment capital becomes more expensive for a region or a company with higher physical climate risk. And the important thing here is that transition risk is often within a company or a region's control, but physical climate risk is completely based on where you are physically. So not something that's easily changed, and also not something that a company or a country is necessarily responsible for. So this concern about capital flight from climate vulnerable regions was conjecture at first. So as I said, there was a second piece that motivated me to bring together environmental justice and this concern about physical climate risk. And this was a report that United Nations Environment Program commissioned and published in 2018, I believe, that empirically showed grounds for these concerns about capital flight. Climate vulnerable countries what's known as the V20, vulnerable 20 countries, were already charged more for investment capital, 117 basis points more. And this was a few years ago, so that data could have evolved. But I wanted to highlight that we as a financial community need to take a step back from only evaluating the climate risk. If we want to participate in climate action and sustainability, we can look at that data, but we also have to consider the implications on people and communities as we're going through this climate transition. So physical climate risk is really where all of these different tensions in sustainable finance come together.
You have gone a little bit also already into environmental justice and this report from the UN. Could you talk a little bit more about environmental justice as such? Because it's a phrase, yeah, we've been hearing it, but I think not that many people are focusing on this.
You know what, it's interesting. In the recent Glasgow Pact from COP26, we saw in the opening lines, forgive me for paraphrasing, but climate justice is important for some countries, which was a bit disheartening because climate change is a collective problem. And when we think about justice, that should be collectively framed as well. But let me take a minute to define environmental justice. And I'm borrowing from some commonly accepted academic definitions, which highlight that environmental justice mandates that climate change burdens should be paid by those who are historically responsible and by those who have the capacity to pay. So we've seen that coming up in the United Nations framework on climate change. In the negotiations that happen internationally, we've seen that coming up in national and domestic, economic policies, where, for example, you look at ways to mitigate carbon price having a negative effect on lower income households. So we do see climate justice coming up and environmental justice coming up in a lot of different areas where people are focused on climate change solutions.
You might think that in governments, there ought to be a specific post for an environmental justice minister, because it's something that needs to combine social conscience, foreign affairs, a legal view, and not a single ministry, I think, at the current stage in governments would take that on. So maybe it's an occasion for also revolution at sort of ministerial level in governments. Who knows?
You know what, I think you're right. And it's interesting because that's something that a lot of people in Canada have been asking for Just Transition Ministry, a Just Transition Act that, isn't even just in one ministry, but is touched on in every single ministry, just like we think climate change should be a pervasive issue. So that's a very topical subject here where I am right now.
I love it. I didn't know that it was being discussed in Canada. So you see, we can learn from each other, and I think that is what's so wonderful, that we can connect and learn from each other. I'm going to go to also what do you think is needed to combine environmental equity and increasing climate-related investments? What messages can you give us there?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting question, and I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to go about that, but a more important thing to think about from the start is, well, why should finance care about climate equity, right? You made a great point that this is so important for governments. It should permeate our public policy, but why should finance care? And I mean, I think there's two thoughts here. One is, frankly, because environmental justice should permeate any conversation about sustainability and climate action. Like we said, a lot of other groups already are, and finance is moving into that space. But also because it's, a threat to the financial system. Climate change is accepted as a threat to the financial system. So perhaps we can get more into that, after I answer some of those examples of how this can be done more practically. I outline in my paper, I think there's kind of three buckets of ways this can happen. First is, through regulation. Second, through voluntary action on the financial sector's part. And third, through public-private partnership. So I think there's been some really innovative solutions in that third bucket. One of my favorite examples is to look at pooled insurance vehicles. I think those are a really superb example where public institutions such as governments will collaborate with the private insurance sector to design ways that areas in high flood risk can contribute based on ability to pay and diversify the risk over a larger area. So looking at, flood RE in the UK or African risk capacity are really great examples, because physical climate risk, as we've said, does not affect everybody equally, and it's something that's out of individuals' control. So looking at collaborative ways to deal with that is a really important solution here. Another framework, as I said, is looking at either voluntary or regulatory mechanisms. And one idea that's quite inspiring that's come out of the EU is the idea of double materiality, where investors should be thinking about not just the risks to their financial portfolio, but the implications that they are having on climate and social issues. So with that framework in mind, if you're thinking about how you are affecting the world, how your investments are affecting the world, that kind of takes the paradox out of pricing in climate risk, because you'll recognize, perhaps as a long-term investor, that it's in your best interest as a financial portfolio holder to improve social conditions, to remedy climate change to the extent we can, and therefore protect the global macro economy and have your portfolio benefit as a result.
I love your reference to double materiality. I too think it's a game changer. If it's taken up seriously, it could really be a game changer. It might be that just little nudge that we'll need to effect all the changes. Julie, I love your essay. I love the passion with which you speak of it. I'm sure other people will listen and see this video, but also read your essay, which will be published shortly. And I'm sure that we'll be hearing more from you on this topic. Keep your spirit and fighting spirit on this, because we need people like you to help effect that change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Josina.